It really is some fantastic work that they are doing. The most incredible part is that it's changing the conversation about Eastern North Carolina, changing the perception that people have about Eastern North Carolina. It's a matter of what it is that we're doing that's going to have an influence in terms of across the state. We think actually across the country is what we're doing in terms of connecting employers to the classroom and making education in middle school relevant. As we've talked about it, it's that point in time in terms of where kids are either turning on or turning off to education. And I think it's really pretty fantastic. I'm going to be challenged here is because I can't read that over there, and that means you probably can't read it either. But what we're about is transformation. It's part of what we talked about in terms of transform, is because we have a number of things in terms of which we're going to be transformational. Transforming meaning in terms of to change completely, usually in a good way, a metamorphosis. So that's a little bit about what we're attempting to do, both for our organization and for our region. I'm going to flash through some of these, but look in terms of how we're doing, how do we compare. We're making progress. We've still got a good ways to go, but in many instances, we're catching up with the state in terms of many of these measurements in terms of performance. These are relative indexes. In other words, they're indexes, they're not absolute values. So you look in terms of those lines showing up, it's how are we moving relative to the state of the whole or the country as a whole. See, in terms of poverty index, yeah, it's all of us are going up. Fortunately, in terms of we're going up at a slightly lesser rate than the state of North Carolina. A little bit higher rate lately, following the track for the U.S. Educational attainment, we're moving in the right direction. We're moving in the right direction for a lot of reasons, but we still need to do better. We have a very wide swath of people that basically have AAS degrees. We still need to keep working on that. Part of that really is what are we doing in terms of retaining college-educated kids, students, young people. We're making progress, dramatic progress. Hats off to our public school systems in terms of the graduation rate. We're basically now on par with the state of North Carolina. Last we looked at it, hard to get in terms of the data, as I think John Harden mentioned, on a national level because it's delayed. Last we checked, though, we're running ahead of the U.S. average in terms of graduation rates. Career readiness certification. Gardner mentioned this in terms of that's one of those gateway analyses in terms of people to move into manufacturing. We now account for 1 of every 4 people that possess a career readiness certificate in the state of North Carolina. That's significant change in terms of where we were. Hats off particularly not only to our community college system folks. We put $1 million into that, but it basically was community college system folks that delivered it. It's a lot of people on the ground, our local economic developers in many instances, selling it, that concept, to where we now have 150 employers that are engaged in using that as their entrance exam, basically, in terms of determining, is this person worth my conversation? Employment establishments found this to be really interesting. Part of what's taking place is we're seeing job growth in terms of our very small employers, less than 10 employees. The other belt in terms of where we're adding jobs, the other ones are basically flatlined, but it's people that employ between 50 or actually 100 to 500 people. That's where we're seeing growth in our region. The very large employers are basically diminished, but fortunately flatlined. So it gives you an indication in terms of what's taking place. New business starts down. Certainly in terms of typically if it was in a recession, you'd start seeing more people start up a new business. But there have been some holdbacks in terms of that. Travel and tourism receipts are up, and that's encouraging. This slide you can't see. Unfortunately, I was looking at the data. But basically, again, we'll mention, you can go on our website and be able to pick up these. And if you get a magnifying glass, you'll be able to read the slide. But essentially what it tells us is we're in the same boat as the triad. We've been losing jobs, and part of it's because we are a manufacturing region. We have a higher percentage still of our workforce engaged in manufacturing. than the other regions of the state of North Carolina. And now manufacturing communities have been challenged. Textiles, tobacco, apparel. Don't have much in the way of furniture, never have. But essentially we're struggling as a result of the magnitude of jobs that we've lost in manufacturing across our region. And that's particularly apparent in places like a Rocky Mount that was a manufacturing city. Same thing here in terms of looking at our unemployment rate. We're beginning to see changes at spotty because there's high degree of variability still from one county to the other, one sub-region of our region to the other. We're seeing in terms of some particular highlights. I wanted to draw out a few. One was in terms of the STEM initiative and the international award that Steve mentioned. Another element I wanted to draw attention to, and it's actually an initiative by ECU, East Carolina University, in working with our community college system around the region, and that is moving exiting military personnel into the workforce within our region. And part of that's moving into the manufacturing workforce, but the beauty of it is working in concert with the community college system. When a vet comes out and moves through this program, they come out with a yellow belt in terms of Lean Six Sigma certification. They've already passed. To be able to get into the program, they have to have their career readiness certificate. And there's another element, again, another certification that they receive as a result. Basically, it makes them work ready in that sense. Thanks to you around the region that helped us basically get that word out, particularly to our industrial community. If you're interested in that, cager at ecu.edu is the person to contact on that. And she'll be able to set you up and put you in front of those folks. Eastern region, as we mentioned it very early on, in terms of the North Carolina's eastern region will disappear come June 30th, basically as a result of the action by the legislature to dissolve the 4 regional rural economic development partnerships across the state. Basically, that was our public entity. Doesn't mean in terms of we as an organization necessarily or staff goes away. It just means we're ramping up a private not-for-profit that'll take its place. And so that's what we've been about over the course of the last year, is ramping up the private not-for-profit while we're actually moving through the process of shutting down the eastern region. But a recap in terms of 20 years. We've provided 106 grants for specific projects, $2.5 million to support our local economic developers in their efforts to actually recruit new companies to the region. Resulted in $1.3 billion worth of investment, about 14,000 new jobs, 13,400 new jobs. We were about capacity building. We've been about capacity building ever since we were born 20 years ago. Capacity building was historically in terms of putting money into hard infrastructure, water, sewer, natural gas lines, shell buildings, technology business incubators or business incubators across the region. Provided grants to be able to do that, provided loans and that. But a surge of those loans over the course of the last year, $7.2 million that it's gone out just within the last year. That's a pretty good sizable amount of money. Overall, it's $35 million just about that we've provided in loans during the course of our history, really, again, to support capacity building throughout the region. We turned to that military growth task force that we stood up several years ago. There's a legacy associated with that, and it's tied really to value-added agriculture. That's a component in terms of what we've brought in and what we continue to use for that. George Miller runs that program for us in terms of food and fuel for the forces, and they're really doing great things and beginning to have a real impact. Does 2 things. One is it builds capacity within our agricultural community, demand for crops, keeping farmers and foresters on the land, and providing a way to be able to also provide jobs in terms of that processing. But the other component of what it does is it creates that demand for that farmland, forest land to continue to produce, and that protects our flight paths, which is the whole core of how we go about protecting our military. Keenly important to us when you think about 90,000 jobs in our region today. Yes, it's declining, and it will, but it's still really incredibly important is how do we preserve those jobs in eastern North Carolina, our largest existing industry. Workforce development, that's what we turned to about 5 years ago. You heard a little bit about that from Steve in terms of STEM East, but it's really undergirded in terms of our workforce development efforts with promoting work keys and CRCs. Again, a tip of the hat to our community colleges in terms of advocating for that, using our money wisely. Part of that thing you heard about Gardner talking about is that focused on manufacturing. When we put that money out there, we had some strings attached. And one of them was you had to deal with jobs that were in the clusters, particularly those that were seeing job growth. And so we basically controlled it, pushed that money into it, so it worked in terms of manufacturing elements, life science, advanced manufacturing, aerospace industries in particular, all three of which have been growing over the course of the last 5 years in our region. And so we had dramatic impact on that. That set the stage for us in terms of our STEM initiative. A promotion of entrepreneurship. It's a matter of, you got a pretty wide spectrum. One is growing your own, whether it's your individuals that you're growing your own, also growing your own companies. I think of one in particular, and hopefully he's still in this room, is Phil Hodges created a company about 15 years ago. Sold it last year for about $115 million. Beauty of that is those jobs are still there. Those 300 jobs he created with his partner John Bray over the course of the last 5 years. They're still here in Eastern North Carolina. That investment is still here in Eastern North Carolina. But there's now $100 million of new capital circulating in this region as a result of that sale. That's a huge impact. STEM, we've already talked about that. No need to go through that again. But what we are in terms of North Carolina's eastern region, we shifted several years ago because we were hearing from our local developers is we're struggling. We're not seeing the client activity that we once had. You need to ramp up your marketing. And so we've done that. Mostly that's come in the last 2 years. And we're making some pretty fantastic process improvements there, spending more money in that arena, yielding better results. And so that now our local developers are talking about we're probably one of the primary sources of new projects for them to have look at their communities. That's going to be an important part for us going forward. So we're making that transition, transforming our organization. That means in terms of we've got a 501c4 corporation. That's what the North Carolina's Eastern Alliance is, doing business as the NC East Alliance. But we also have access to a 501c3 corporation, which allows us to take grants from foundations, gifts from foundations, or individual gifts to be able to support our programs going forward. Our trust fund is basically gone. It will be gone by June 30th. We were managing a $22.5 million trust fund. About 14 or 15 million of it came from the region, the other 7.5 from the state. When that money is paid back in terms of those loans that are outstanding in terms of those state funds, that money basically will go back to Raleigh and be distributed and used in terms of however they see fit. So there's been a surge of about $20 million into our regional economy as a result of the dissolution of our region, going back to those counties and being used by those counties in terms of economic development related projects. We hope we'll see a pretty sizable benefit from that going forward in terms of giving us a little bit of a lift, of a boost to our regional economy. But we went through this process. The timeline, you can see it. I'm not going to belabor it, but we hired a group called National Community Development Services to come in and advise us. Thank you, Tom DiFiore, for being here today. We hadn't been through this before. I'd raised money before, but it was for very specific items, not basically as operational. So we called in some help. Our board agreed to do that. We basically went through that whole process. We're engaged in that now. We engaged regional leadership in two ways. One is interviewing them to begin with, about 50 or so odd people. Then we gathered about 70 people around the table, invited them to come to a meeting and said, this is what we heard from the interviews we gathered, the comments about is there a need for a regional economic development organization? If so, what should it be doing? And now we come back and sit down with those 70 people and say, this is what we got back. Do you agree with this? Tweaked it a little bit, and so we've now come out with a plan. We had the Secretary of Commerce come down and visit with our board about a month ago. Also met with all local economic developers to have a conversation about what was going on at the state level. If any of you know, please call me and let me know. Because the challenge is we really don't know what's happening at the state level, and we won't know for about another 45 days at least. Because unfortunately, in terms of there have been a little fits and starts, posed some challenges for us. But it was nice of the Secretary to come down and have a conversation with us. And the value of it is the placing, clearing up that statement is that Regional economic development organizations are going to be important to the state going forward. The Raleigh staff is going to depend upon those regional economic development organizations for support, for client handling, and fortunately in terms of we have a good reputation in terms of doing that going forward. There's also recognition in terms of even within the Department of Commerce. Hopefully that's going to translate for us in terms of more projects dealing with that number one issue in terms of quality of labor. So strategic components in terms of our plan is marketing and business attraction, number one. About 90% of people said that is really important for us going forward. About 75 to 80% said workforce development and education, critical in terms of our survival in terms of this region, particularly in terms of our big employers coming back, even our smaller technology-driven employers saying that's critical in terms of our future. And then regional advocacy. If you know in terms of what's happening in terms of the population shift, you know why advocacy and regional advocacy is important for us. I put this slide in because we're talking about regions. This isn't John Chaffee's regions. This isn't somebody else's creation in terms of locally. This is how the Bureau of Economic Analysis for the federal government defines, if you want to refer to it, the natural economy that exists in eastern North Carolina. It's a little bit of a surprise to people. They do actually refer to that one as being the Greenville Economic Region, but the oddity of it is it's a bipolar region. The two biggest and most rapidly growing metro areas in that are Jacksonville and Greenville, and they're very, very different. But those are the two poles. The other is in terms of what I refer to, actually, it's a sub-region. It's the I-95, 795 corridor. But those counties are identified by the BEA as that's the interrelationship between those counties in terms of how the money flows from one county to the other. So we're rebranding ourselves. Part of that is in terms of, we launched a new website. So if you go to our website, nceast.org, this is what you're going to see today, is in terms of switching that name over and calling it NC East Alliance and moving forward. Our folks have done a great job. I'm really thrilled about the logo because, as you can tell, that logo is kind of hard to say where are the lines drawn, and that's the whole point. We don't know where the lines are going to be drawn going forward. That'll all sort itself out as we move forward in terms of the series of the next months, probably even maybe the next year in terms of what is the geography going to be for the NC East Alliance. We're amenable to a number of changes, and we think it will change. Looking in terms of what it was we're going to do, biggest part is branding or rebranding Eastern North Carolina. We finally figured out, we think, how to go about doing that. It's really relying upon those of you in local communities feeding information to us so that then we can craft the story that then goes out and talks about this is really what is Eastern North Carolina, not defined by people outside our region, but how we define it. One of the biggest things we found about is people did not understand in terms of the diversity of our region, the diversity of our economy. I always thought of us as being a tourist destination and ag. And yeah, there might be some military people that float around down there every now and then. Well, blown away was we employ 12,000 people in the aerospace industry. We employ about 6,000, depending upon how you define the region, maybe 8,000 people in life science. Significant and important in communicating that information. Clusters are important to us. So we've gone through in terms of the mapping. That's only one little bit in terms of what we're going to do about approaching our strategy as an economic development organization in terms of cluster development. But we've at least defined our clusters, and we've mapped our clusters so we kind of know what they look like. But then it's a matter of drilling down. We're doing that in partnership actually with UNC Keenan Center of Private Enterprise. Is helping us fund this. We've contracted with a firm called Kemper Strategies, working with Leslie Stewart. And they're going to come basically in and look at just two of our clusters, motor vehicle manufacturing and the aerospace sector. And basically working with our local developers, going around and interviewing companies, the lead companies in that, and then going around and talking to potential companies in the supply chain, analyzing where's the gap, what are the opportunities for us there, and what is their interest in terms of supporting our efforts in that moving forward. So we'll do quite a bit of that. But you can't rely upon that totally. Certainly we understand that you have to have a little bit more of a broad-based marketing approach. We will do that. So we're going to be looking at still selectively going into target geographic areas and marketing, advertising in some cases, aligning ourselves, building other alliances. We've just done that. We expect to generate significant amount of leads as a result of associating with the World Economic Development Alliance. But we're still going to be involved, still going to be accessible to be able to help our local communities understand what's going on in their communities and what they might do in terms of strategies to build their economies. Again, we have a very diverse region. It's very few of our communities or our counties that can essentially deploy the same strategies and win because they are so different. So we'll still be accessible to doing that. Just some numbers in terms of reporting. What are we yielding to date in terms of our efforts that we launched really largely 2 years ago? But we're making really good progress in that. This is our footprint in terms of where we've been and where we're going in terms of marketing Eastern North Carolina. One of those other is it's important for us to get face-to-face. It's also important for us to get the message out. So we appreciate those of you that have helped us in terms of developing articles about Eastern North Carolina, about our aerospace industry, picked up by over 100 media outlets across the country. Automotive sector, same way, even across the Atlantic, picked up in the UK. So getting that message out and getting it picked up by media outlets is really important to us. Can't replace that because we don't have enough money to buy the advertising space to do it, but we can put out stories about what's going on in our region and have it be picked up. Workforce development, don't need to belabor that. You can go and see it. Go to ncworkready.org and see the impact that we've had in terms of our Career Readiness Certificate Work Keys Initiative, and now also STEM and STEMeast.org. The other is still regional advocacy. One of the things I was talking with one of our representatives that's here from Havelock, and that is, if we take things individually, we're going to have marginal success. If we take it collectively, we've got a much better opportunity. So even a matter of pulling together our military communities that have really great support groups locally is pulling those together regionally. And then we all have that conversation about what's the interaction between all of their interests, and then what's the collective wisdom and what's the collective strategy to be able to go forward to protect our military assets, because they are going to be under assault, no question about it. As we're winding down in terms of our military nationwide, they're going to be looking in terms of cost savings. And so we've hopefully developed a few strategies to be able to help with that, logistics being one of them. The other is how do we basically make the case that all of these military installations in Eastern North Carolina are really interrelated, and they all revolve around air power, training pilots. So that's about where we are. Bottom line is we will become what it is we decide and determine will be ourselves in terms of, I think, in a collaborative fashion. The other is in terms of, I assume most of you are here because you do want to make a difference in terms of your region. And then it's a matter of you committed to being part of the process and part of the team that's going to make that happen. We intend to be, and we invite you to join us. I'll take it back in terms of some of the folks that attended some of our meetings. Put this slide up. This is a great coach. He understood in terms of what it took to make a team. And that is, it's just not a team because it's a team. It's a team because the individuals involved in that team were willing to put forth the individual effort to make it work. And that's, I think, what we have to be about in Eastern North Carolina. So I really appreciate all of you that stayed with us, have stayed with us all along, have already pledged your support to go forward with us. The latest being Wayne County. Really appreciate in terms of their county commissioners adopting a resolution to support us moving forward. We look forward to working with you in the future. We think, yeah, we have a lot of challenges in Eastern North Carolina, but there's an enormous amount of opportunity. And if we can come together, collectively define it, develop strategies to pursue it, we can win. And I think we've already demonstrated that, and we'll do it again. So, again, thank you. The bars are open right outside this room. Have a drink. I wish I could say on us, but we're not quite that wealthy. But we do welcome you to stay, engage in the conversation. Our speakers are going to be here for a little bit, so please approach them, pose your questions, and hopefully you have a great conversation. Again, thanks to Transportation Impact for actually sponsoring our reception. And again, everybody have a good evening and a safe trip home. Thanks for being here.